the end of class on Tuesday, Kandinsky had moved from Russia, his birth country, to the city of Munich in Germany, and starts another artistic group there. So we looked at Kirchner, it was in Dresden and then Berlin, right? And we've seen other artists in Berlin as well, like Katie Kollwitz, who's worked with us that kind of briefly. But Kandinsky is stationed primarily in Munich, and both of these images show that area. Munich is kind of to the south and really right on the base of the Alps, more or less. It's not particularly alpine, right? But it's sitting right on the foothills of the Alps. So it's a mountainous region of Germany. And here he's painting a small town, a small medieval town outside of Munich called Murnau. And you can see that he focuses on the church tower that he even seems to transpose into this mountainous landscape you see on your left, where he's gone much more abstract in the years between 1909 and 1912, right? You can still see the semblance of that tower, but abstracted somewhat. And his choice of the church tower, I think, is incredibly important for our understanding of what Kandinsky is up to, what he's trying to do as an artist, why he's going abstract. And that is that he uses imagery while he's still painting visible imagery, recognizable motifs. While he's still painting recognizable motifs, he chooses motifs that have a certain spiritual symbolism, a certain religious symbolism that you could use to actually not necessarily be overtly Christian, even though they tend to be that from Western traditions, right? But he doesn't see them as being Christian. He sees them as being the bearers of a particularly spiritual content. Okay? So the church tower is an important symbol for him, right? And we'll see others as well. And as he moves away from physical description, representation, he wants to maintain that spiritual symbolism somehow. And he wants to find out how. He wants to find out where that kind of those spiritual references really reside. And eventually his answer to that is that it resides in a combination of color and shape. And shape means everything from line to two-dimensional shape to even perhaps three-dimensional shape. Because those things actually do have spiritual content apart from the recognizable subject matter. Okay, so the abstract form itself bears spiritual content. And that if we can strip away the references to the world around us, we can find a sort of more universal spirituality. The spirituality that lies behind the mask of the physical world. And this is something that has plagued artists through the centuries, through the millennia. Is how do you paint something that has spiritual content if the painting reminds you of the physical world? You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Because the stuff of this world, any theologian in any religion will tell you, is just in the way of us understanding the supernatural. That's what they call it, supernatural, right? It's above nature. It's behind, it's higher than that. Metaphysical means the same thing. Meta, above, physical, physicality. How can you paint something physical and have it be something spiritual? We find even artists like Michelangelo, who's the champion of physicality, right? Think of this big, muscular, burly people, right? Superhuman. By the end of his life, he just realizes that there's a problem with that. Because that celebrates the flesh. That celebrates the physical world, and he's trying to celebrate the spiritual world. Right? So how do you make an art that does that? And Kandinsky, his trajectory from 1909 to basically 1913, those 4 years of his life as he moves increasingly away from representation, is an attempt to find what's spiritual about art beyond the simple conjuring of metaphors in the physical world. Right? How do you make an art that's supernatural? Okay? So that's his basic problem. That's his basic question. And as we trace his works, we're going to see, in a certain level, that this is what's underscoring everything he's doing. That he takes recognizable religious, quasi-religious imagery, images with religious overtones, and he finds something else by reworking it again and again and again. Now, why he does it and how he does it will be the focus of what we talk about today. One of the things that people have pointed to for the why he does it element is the fact that he was Russian by descent, and that he had grown up around icons. Icons are supposed to be those works of art that form a conduit between our physical world and the spiritual world. They're supposed to provide a place for the Virgin Mary to be as she hears your prayers, to bring her to your presence. And if we look at the tradition of Russian icons that Kandinsky would have known very, very well, there is a certain abstract quality to them. The artists don't aim toward representing things with a serious three-dimensionality. They're really flat. You know, there's some modeling to the base, but on the norm, the figures are rendered in a kind of abstract manner, and against a flat gold background that's meant to evoke heaven itself. So with the knowledge of the fact that those works of art that were deemed by society to be most spiritual were those that pushed away from representing the physical world in a recognizable manner, are the ones that are the most effective in doing so, right? That's one of the reasons people think that Kandinsky moved away from representation and toward abstraction, is he's sort of hardwired for that by the culture that he came from, by being Russian. And later in the class, we'll see that, in fact, not only him, but there's another artist that actually pushes even further than him into that abstraction, and he's also Russian. So there's something in the water there, right? I heard at the artscape night that people had to drink dirty water through a straw that's supposed to filter it, right? But maybe it wasn't filtered in Russia, right? Maybe there was something in the water there, right? So we'll look at Kandinsky, sort of trace this. I really have this too for the landscape issue, the Phillips picture and the landscape with power. But I want to look at the images of the horsemen, because for Kandinsky, the idea of the mounted horseman is really an important theme for him. In fact, it's quite central to his ideas and his aims in making art. The quasi-spiritual theme for him. In this case, these horsemen are climbing a blue mountain with, I presume, to be trees around them, but it's not entirely clear what those masses of yellow and red are really supposed to be, other than color explosions, right? And you'll notice that he's probably looked at some faux works. The colors are channeling some of those incredibly rich colors that we saw with Durand and with Matisse, right? And we have these horsemen coming from the lower left and moving their way upward. You can see it's a slight ascent, and you get the sense that they're climbing the mountain, which in itself can be seen as a sort of a quasi-spiritual theme. Climbing a mountain, right? Martin Luther King, right? I have been to the mountaintop. Right? You think of all these mountain references, and the idea of climbing a mountain is a way of describing a sort of spiritual ascendance, right? And the fact that they're mounted horsemen brings in references to crusaders, right? People fighting for religion, or simply just medieval knights, right? Entering into it. And just as the landscape of Murnau on your right focuses on this very old city, our old horsemen are dressed in traditional Russian costumes. And in the lower left corner, you can see, looks like Cossacks maybe, right? Figures with the fur hat down here. And I like the hipster beanie there with the long up the back. It looks like it's something they wear in Portland when they're brewing beer, or making right, something you see in Portlandia, right? Making their own pickles. Yeah. Does that reference work for you guys? All the other ones seem to get lost. But there's a sense of these traditional figures that are time preserved into the present almost, windows into a lost spirituality. There's even the idea in the lower right corner that there's another one of these traditional figures with a purple hat and a green face, right? And the horsemen there, in this case there are, I believe, just 3 of them. But he himself, Kandinsky, talked about the horsemen as being a very particular reference. He said that the horsemen for him were a symbol of St. George, that valiant knight who fought against the forces of evil, who fought against the dragon that was endangering this town and saved the young maiden from being fed to the dragon. It's a tiny little picture of the National Guard, a good example of any, of St. George fighting against the dragon. And so for Kandinsky, what he sees with these images of horsemen, he might say, well, gosh, that's awfully violent as a theme, but the point is that he's fighting against convention. He wants to use these traditional things and think about his art as something that's breaking through to something new, bringing a message of spiritualism, and fighting against the demons of tradition. And he will maintain the horse and rider theme consistently as he abstracts. Another reference point that a number of people have pointed to is the idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, who come to destroy the earth, come to wipe everything off the earth at the end of time to establish the millennial reign of Christ in the future. And again, this idea of the horsemen going across could bring about a realm where the physical world's wiped clean, right? And can be set up for something new. So, Albert Dürer, woodcutter, those of you who do prints, right, Gracie, imagine trying to carve the negative space in that sucker. It just blows me away, right? Absolutely blows me away. He carves cross-hatching, What? Indeed, it's incredibly proficient that way. But you can see that the forces here rearing up and moving from left to right seem very much to be sort of formal reference back, even if there's only 3 of them. It's sort of evoking this idea of them going across the countryside to clear the way for a new and better world, a utopia again. And that's kind of the important thing about these early German expressionists, these artists working prior to World War I, is that within their works, whether it's Kandinsky or Kirchner, who have very different agendas, they both share a utopianism, a hopefulness that their art can create a better world, right? Can actually have a say in the future. And for Kandinsky, we'll see it's really a very different tack than what Kirchner was up to, right? So ushering in a new age, an art that ushers in the new age. And he continues to rework this knight and rider motif in later work as he moves increasingly abstract. And as he moves abstract, the titles become more abstract as well. Instead of calling it something that makes a reference to the physical world, he names them after just composition, right? Improvisation. He uses musical terminology. And this, I think, is an important part for him, for Kandinsky, because he sees an analogy between music and art. So if you look at the picture on the right, it might at first seem to be really quite abstract. But then the more that we look at it, the more that we can see, in fact, that it is filled with things that might be somewhat recognizable. So what we see in this picture that we can immediately recognize. Let's back up. Before we talk about that, let's talk about things that are still there from the past. Is there anything in this picture that is translated over in a less immediately recognizable form, which is almost as if split it in? Yeah, Prometheus. You can still see horses, right? You can certainly see in the center, right? It looks more like you ride a polar bear almost, doesn't it? It really doesn't look like a polar bear, but there's definitely a man on a horseback there. And other figures directly behind him, right? And even directly behind that green-headed horseman, there's another guy that almost looks like a bearded prophet or something, you know? A white bearded prophet, you know? Other things that we can see that repeat. Of course, looks like, yes, Jake. Indeed. So those mountain motifs that we saw also in the Murnau pictures, right, is still there. And it gives form and mountain on this. And it's, you don't have to be Martin Luther King for the dances out. So think about, Moses on Mount Sinai, right? Muhammad's ascension from the mount. All of these different elements. Christ, when he is transfigured, is on the mountain as well, right? So the mountain is this really poignant symbol for him. And you get these mountain motifs in the background. It gives us a flashes, explosions of color in the sky, right? It's almost like it's a fireworks display. The heaven is erupting, opening it up, right? And then it don't hurt your voice too much, but I don't want to cut you off behind it. So the colors very much are translated over. This is the same color, for example, as we see up in the north, right? Even with your shots with that blue inside it. It's a bit more washed out, and what's interesting about Kandinsky in this translation from recognizable to increasingly unrecognizable, I think it's a little bit different too, right? So he's really working it rather quickly. Now, there's other things here that I think are rife with metaphoric content, in addition to the horses and the mountains, the explosions of color in the sky, that we can point to. I think that large thing in the center, which may look like a horse's head, is this here. But could be an echo of that church tower from Murnau, right? And even these things over here have been pointed to as being potentially church towers as well. So then if you look at it more closely, you start to see this in the lower left corner, we still have the group of figures looking on. Very similar to the horses here. Only they're just standing here. Similar to these figures that are looking on. And then we get all these other elements that are all about like resurrection. This figure here, right? Standing with the looks to be a fist in the air, right? Over here, a figure rising from the dead. A symbol of resurrection. Or what? Right. Or it could be images of the Madonna child from the Middle Ages, where she's always become in Christ. That's another possibility. He's divorcing it from the, he doesn't want it to be narrative. He doesn't want it to tell the story, but pull away from that to find something that is spiritual in essence rather than spiritual in narrative, right? So he's taking up these themes, this figure here, either a crucifixion scene or again another resurrection, right, coming up out of the grave. And then numerous other things, right? Figures moving around. And with all of them, there seems to be a movement in this direction. Right? Even the brushstrokes give you that movement in the upper right corner. And this is the goal. This is the quest. And this is the prize. And above it is this reference to the sun. And if we do indeed take these to the church towers and various forms, then that's what they seem all to be striving for. Moving in that direction. But he's taking it and he's pushing it increasingly unrecognizable. Now, the figure in the center that I mentioned that looks like a cross between the horse's head here and the tower at Murnau is most likely, I think, a horse. And the horseman, as I mentioned, is a really poignant symbol for Kandinsky. He used it on the cover of his famous treatise concerning the spiritual in art, where many of the forms that appear here appear there as well, with the idea of the horse itself, right, rising up. Here. A book that everybody should try to get. It's one of the great writings on art in the modern era, and I mentioned De Gracie. And my office, you can probably find it for $1 on Amazon. It's not that big. And really quite interesting. He's as good a writer about art as he is an artist himself. As he continues to develop, he takes the same motifs and he just keeps pushing it towards increasing abstraction. So I would argue as we look at this that many of the forms we've been seeing in Blue Mountain and in this sketch for composition number 2 on the right, many of those forms are still here. The question is where and how do we read it? Help me out. It's not meant to be entirely non-representational yet, although Kandinsky is often credited with being the artist who first gave us non-representational art. Do you still see anything? Okay. Mm-hmm. Where are you looking? Lower right? Lower left, right. This bit over here. It seems like the figure C and the right thing, maybe white line, and so we've got this wonderful rainbow here, quite obvious rainbow with the sun behind it. But then there's also another set up here with aura around it and kind of nestled behind these towers or and it holds the rock either way. And then again, a Blue Mountain, right? It's still so obviously there. It also seems that we have our watching figures, right? And yeah, it's interesting that he likes to work in these threes. Amanda held up 3 fingers. And in fact, one thinks about whether or not there are Trinitarian references here. But you notice that the arc of the mountain begins to repeat in sort of disembodied art, looks like the Star Trek logo, here. But just taking those forms and repeating it, because what he realizes is that it's not the mountain, what he wants us to think about is whether or not the mountain itself has spiritual content, or whether or not just the simple form that we use for mountain can carry that same spiritual content. And so we end up getting, based on what we've seen before, a movement toward these disembodied lines. One wonders if this isn't perhaps the blue line from the deck of the animal here, or the tower here, now translated to Egypt. Oh, totally, yeah. When you find this like universal harmony, right, between all of these different elements, yeah. And I think I mentioned this on Tuesday. When I was an undergrad, I found this was like cheating. It looked too easy, But I think in the long run, this is a really difficult step to make, to divorce yourself from the comfort of what you can see around you, right? This idea of the rainbow, which is really, I think, the single most obvious element, and maybe the mountain as well, should remind us about like the promise. Right? Well, when does that happen? When does the promise of the rainbow happen? After the flood, right? When the waters subside, the deluge subsides. If you think about that as a metaphor, we think about 4 horsemen, right? They're clearing the land for a new beginning, right? St. George is clearing the dangers around the city so that it can do. The flood, God was clearing the land, clearing it of sin, clearing it of chaos for a new beginning. So all of these references work with what we know to be Kandinsky's agenda, which is to start a new utopian beginning, to use his art as a way of clearing the way. Right? And could the mountain here, the Blue Mountain, all of a sudden become, his Mount Ararat, where the ark landed? Are these other references? And if he Noah, right, seeing us through to the promised land, and hopefully not having Noah's fate where he gets all drunk and seduced by his daughters, But Noah, at least at the beginning of the story. Sons, that's right, he gets drunk and his son can't make it. I got him confused with Lot, because thank you for clearing up my Old Testament theology. So where are these ideas coming from, right? This idea that there's a utopian world out there if we can get past the physical world, right? That we should see through the physical world to find something else that is itself perfect. Where do those ideas come from? Because those are what Kandinsky's pushing us toward, right? That's why he takes the physical forms and he manipulates them to increasingly be abstract forms. This comes directly out of a movement called Theosophy, which is a late 19th century spiritualist movement that was founded in upstate New York. Now, I don't know if you know about this, but upstate New York in the late 19th century is this hotbed of spiritual movements, right? There's a lot of, dare I say, really weird stuff going on. Sorry? Exactly. Spiritualism, Unitarians start there, right? But other movements as well that are off the beaten religious path, if you will, right? And have religious elements but are not necessarily Christian. And Theosophy was one of them. And the founder in the late 19th century was this woman named Madame Blavatsky. There she is, right? A portrait of Madame Blavatsky. Founded the Theosophical movement, Theosophy. And here's what she said about Theosophy. And by the way, the reason I'm bringing this in is that Kandinsky acknowledged that he was very much influenced by Theosophy. Okay? And what Blavatsky said was that Theosophy was really the basis for all religions and all philosophies throughout all time. Make no small claims, right? The basis for all religions and philosophies of all time. Everything's connected. And that they called it an archaic wisdom religion that was known at one time in every ancient civilization. Right? So it is what do you want to call it, the core of knowledge that lies behind Judaism, that lies behind Islam, that lies behind Christianity, that lies behind Buddhism. Theosophy. It is the thing that connects these ancient religions and philosophies together. And with that idea of connectedness and unity behind the different manifestations, right? That there's a unity behind it all. One of the primary tenets of Theosophy is that there is, in this world, everything is united by a sense of harmony that we don't see because the world is too noisy, the world is too chaotic. And that if we can look, if we can stop being distracted by the noise and the chaos of the world, I use noise metaphorically, I'm not talking about the sound, right? The chaos of the world, if we can get past that, what we'll find hidden beneath it is a perfect metaphysical harmony. You see how meditation is sort of, the idea that you just like stop and listen to your heart for a while and ignore everything else that's out there to do some deep breathing in a way. And almost every artist that I know about who begins to move toward abstract art, around 1910, there are quite a few of them, right around the same time, moving toward abstraction. They are all into Theosophy on one level or another. And it might seem like this goofy offshoot of state New York spiritualist movement, but it had a lot of purchase in the early 20th century, and pushed artists towards finding something beyond the world around them. And moving from art that is simply representation, which is where we started this class, to art that is something entirely different. Art that is a conduit to a shared spirituality that links all humans together. Now, we're fortunate to have some of these early Kandinskys floating around D.C. and the wider area. And you'll notice that as he moves toward abstraction and away from representation, the title has all become musical. they shift entirely to musical terms. So the very first one he calls improvisation. There's a whole series of those. Then he starts doing compositions. Then he starts a series called impressions. And those are all musical terms as well. Have been used in music for much, much longer. And in many ways, he's seeing his art as being nothing but aesthetic in a way, and producing the same sense of harmony that can remove us from this world that music does. You know, a good music concert. I'm not a huge classical music person, but you know, when you bury when I was a kid, I had headphones in my bedroom in the basement of my parents' house, you know, cranking, I don't know, records by Yes, early Genesis record with Peter Gabriel still wasn't cranking it as loud as I could, right? And it puts you in a different place, you know, opening up the gatefold records, so you stick your nose into the paintings. And you see his art doing the same thing as an immersive experience that can transport you away from this world and to this world where there is a sense of almost total harmony that's not different from music. We think now that he may well have suffered from a neurological, I refrain to call it the defect because he seems to have profited from it. But synesthesia has been diagnosed as a neurological miswiring in one system where you can confuse your different sensory reactions so that you can actually smell color, people who have it, or hear smells, right? And when Kandinsky writes about color in Concerning the Spiritual Art, he says, when I see a blue, I hear a cello. So he admits to sort of associating music and visual things together, auditory and visual being. To have synesthesia? I totally agree. And I think part of it is that many artists, we go back to Whistler, for example. You remember, Whistler's mother, right? It's called something like Symphony in Gray and Black. And he also is using these terms, these musical terms for his pictures, right? And the reason that he's doing it is he wants it to be accepted independent from its subject matter as just art, in the same way that music is. Music doesn't have to be narrative to be considered great art. And he was hopefully pushing the fact that we should judge art, visual art, the same way. Now, he's not moving toward any sense of trying to establish a utopia, like Kandinsky is. But he still is drawing that connection. And for artists that are pushing beyond an art that has to tell a very particular story, like seen from Roman history, say, right? Or even a scene of everyday life, to an art that should be appreciated as being the production of an artist, a position with its own aesthetic merits. Those artists will often draw that analogy, right? For Kandinsky, Yurgens's book even brings this up, that he thinks now that he may well have had synesthesia, where there was for him a direct connection in the way that he understood it. And he tries to bring that out in his paintings, that he sees his compositions in the way that Bach would have seen composing music. And you actually could hear things in that. Well, the one on the right, again, one of these early breaks with traditional subject matter, does not have the same roots as the Horsemen and the Mountains, but has a very different sort of subject matter that he's moved away from. You might remember this from intro class. Do you remember what the subject matter of this was? What his basis for his abstraction was with this one? I haven't given you the full title because that would give it away. Right? The proposition is not the full title. The proposition 31, and then in the parentheses, it says something more. Let's look at what we have here. Right? We've got the standard Kandinsky element of these disembodied lines, here rising, and then we've got elements that sort of look like what we saw with the sun before, almost here and here and here. This floats exactly. Now, he calls it the Sita, right? And those lines that you see at the bottom can almost quickly then be read as the splashes of cannons, right? And I think it's kind of fascinating that Kandinsky, as he's getting us to look past the chaos of the world of science harmony, he's getting us incredibly chaotic scenes of it, right? Scenes of warfare, scenes that could be considered scenes of violence. And yet, with that, he's finding this realm beyond, right? That is the fantastic realm of color and beauty and composition, right? And nothing really more than that. You'll notice that, remember when he said that when I paint a green, it's not grass, when I paint a blue, it's not sky. You can see how people look back at Moses and they're being such an important trendsetter for the way in which modern art develops, because for Kandinsky as well, we have those bright flashes of yellow and red in the sky, right? And that the blues that appear there appear to be sailcloth, as opposed to being part of the landscape or part of the sky. And even the water down below looks more like what Dan might have done, right? So the bikini pictures, we saw the purple ground down below, or the red ground underneath the vision after the sermon. I think so, yeah. I think that's the ocean, but again, it's coming out as that coral. I don't think he's going to go that far. I don't think he's going to do an Evil Dead 2 on us or anything like that. You know, we're going to have sloshing our way through blood. I think instead that the colors are not meant to be representational, but again, are meant to be symbolic or spiritual in and of himself. And what he's picking up are some of the wave forms, which is more like Dorna, the splashing forms, but then he's using those as the basis. You know, one of the boats become one of the basic square. And again, if we think back to the first images, not only are he giving us other chaos in the past, but also remember that Kandinsky sees his art as fighting a battle. Right? A battle against evolution. That he is, in his own utopian way, he's waging war against representation. Right? And in the 19th century, the Russian art world, other than the religious, was very traditional. They were still doing the things that French artists had started doing at the beginning of the 19th century. Images of peasant labor, you know. And he was a great aspect to really push towards something significantly more modern. Because rural peasant labor for Russia was part of their everyday experience. They were much further behind most of Europe when it came to adopting industrial technology, you know. And as part of bringing to music in the first place, a much more modern world, and he wants to make it part of it. That's what this is. Let's go to the next picture. Our other local, I meant that's a segue much more nicely, but there we are. He did this sketch for a painting of Moscow that is today in the Phillips, and the final version on your right is in the Guggenheim in New York, where he's changed it. And what he said here, and again this idea of synesthesia, is that he was trying to visualize the sounds of Moscow. He's trying to give the sounds of Moscow a visual form. So he's translating between the auditory again and the visual. And what he said in so doing is that he was going to try to use two basic motifs that he saw to be traditionally Russian and he associated with Moscow. And he was going to translate those in. And one of these was St. George. Okay? And the reason for this is Tsar Peter the Great had St. George as on his emblem, right? And the other thing that he was looking for was, as a metaphor for this, was a chariot drawn by 3 horses, which again we saw on the Blue Mountain, right? The 3-horse sled, if you will, what's called a troika. It's the Russian word for a chariot drawn by 3 horses. So the question is, where are they? Are they here anywhere? St. George, we've seen St. George and the Dragon. Do we see St. George, or do we see the troika anywhere? You'll notice that with the final version, we have many of the same motifs. He's just changed it from portrait to landscape in orientation, right? But many of the motifs are there, those red upside-down V shapes, right? The large white bar running across. You see St. George anywhere? Yeah? Gracie? Why can't you? Remember that we saw St. George at the lance going after the dragon, and the dragon started throwing his neck around and sort of fight back. And so, one of the things that we think is this is certainly St. George's lance, which would make perhaps this the figure of the saint himself. Now, totally abstract, right? But then this area down here, which in many of his pictures seems to be the area, like he's almost like he's separating it between utopia is up here in the upper right, and chaos is in the lower left. But these spinning elements down here, we can see at the dragon's mouth, the fire in the dragon's mouth, firing back at St. George. And maybe he's here, maybe he's here. It's hard to say exactly for sure, but there we've got elements we've seen before here. And what about the troika? What about the idea of a 2-horse sled? Is it anywhere to be seen? What is this? You know? This is the Russian flag. Right? They have red, white, and blue as well. As do the French, as do the Bulgarians, right? As do the Dutch, as do we. But this is certainly a reference to that here, and then we have these. Here? I wonder, I'm looking at that area, and I'm wondering about this thing as well, because we saw this form as almost being like a monk in our picture. Coming down, and is that almost that? Again, I think if we're doing, as we're doing this, of course, we're almost violating what's in this humor. Because really what he wants you to see is not the chaos of school. He wants you to pass that. And he really wants you to see the harmony that comes through the whole thing. The fact that he wrote about Kandinsky is that in the history of art, we'll always talk about Kandinsky as being the father of abstract art, as the one that really went in first. Even though, even at this point, there's still some traces of recognizability, right? We can see where the roots of this all came from. But there's this story that, and it might be the fiction, because it's kind of a fascinating story. He says that, as he was working, pushing himself and trying to take those forms and purify them, right? Distill them to this essence that is a spiritual essence, right? He said that one time he came back to his studio and he said he saw this painting laying on the floor in the studio. He didn't know where it came from. And it was done. It was perfect. It had broken through what he was trying to break through to get top, right? It is actually presented forms that were spiritual without being representational at all. And he didn't remember ever painting it, and as he went up to him, he could actually realize it was one of the pictures that he had put down on his side, right? And that helped him to break through to making works of art that did not have to be representation. that could be utterly divorced from the idea of, Jenny, look at this and find this. Right? So in other words, you would come in here and kick my ass for talking to you these things the way I have been. You know what I mean? Because that's not what you're supposed to be looking at. What you're supposed to be looking at or looking for is an art that pushes you into this insufferable harmony that lies behind everything. In fact, it's 100 years old. And these are ideas that I think are still incredibly current. You know? What's going on right now in the world, don't you want an art that's going to present yourself as an alternative to the vast amount of ugliness that the world presents? You know? And I think that's the case. Especially if we're one another World War I, tensions are flailing, you know? And he'll continue to push this as we move further on. Now, a bit of background on this. Wait, let's see. Yeah. If you think about Kandinsky, and then we'll quit at 4:30, but Kandinsky had moved to Moscow already in the 1890s, right? So he's been there for 25 years by this time, right? And when he got there, when he got to Moscow, he actually founded an artistic group that was attempting to make a more modern kind of art. And they went by the acronym NKVM, the Neue Künstlervereinigung München, the New Artists Union in Munich, right? NKVM. He founded this group, and the whole point of the group was to try to promote new directions in art, right? Try to push art in ways that had not been pushed before. And what's interesting about this group that Kandinsky helped found is that as his works became less recognizable, as his works became abstract, right, non-representational, the group he founded rejected him. How's that for a kick in the teeth? You know? I put this group together to help find new directions in art, and they basically kick him out. And at the end of 1911, he decided that he's just going to leave. Fine. I'll found a different group that will do what I really plan to do. And he calls this new group in 1911 that he puts together Der Blaue Reiter, which means the Blue Knight or the Blue Rider. Reiter means both, right? The Blue Horseman, the Blue Rider, the Blue Knight. The Blaue Reiter. And you can see that the name of the group is based on his favorite metaphor from early on, which was the idea of the crusader, riding up the Blue Mountain and assailing tradition, fighting against tradition, and pushing art toward a new direction. So he found this new group with a group of artists that also lead the NKVM with him, and they begin to publish a journal as well. Great news. We're going to Kandinsky. You might want to look into this. Right? The Blue Rider Journal published not only their paintings, reproductions of their paintings and their compositions, but also published theoretical writings on what is art and poetry as well. Right? This movement is going to transcend simply painting because they've got a bigger agenda than that, right? It doesn't just sit on the easel. It's got to have resonance beyond that. So it's going to be in other forms than simply in painting itself, right? So other artists join him as part of this group called the Blue Rider. And I'm going to show you a couple of those before we quit on with this. Alexei Delansky. You might mistake this for Kandinsky. In fact, when I saw it at the National Gallery, I said, "Hey, Kandinsky," I went running over to him. No, it's not. Because it has some of the same forms, maybe not as bold as Kandinsky, insofar as the pink cloud in the sky still has some semblance of description, but it still has that same interest in the mountain, right, as part of the metaphor, maybe even the idea of these abstract forms in the foreground, ascending the mountain. But it's that same little town outside of Munich that we saw Kandinsky painting, right? And he too moved to Munich at almost the exact same time as Kandinsky, and they met up right away, and he joined the NKVM with Kandinsky, and also then left it with Kandinsky to join the Blue Rider group as well. Right? The most famous artist that left the NKVM to join the Blue Rider was Franz Marc. And his works, too, go through a really kind of astounding transformation from 1910 to 1912 or 13 or so. But he shares many of Kandinsky's ideas, one of which is that the world sucks. That there's got to be something better out there. And for Franz Marc, this is what I love about Franz Marc, it was animals. People, it's not the world that sucks, it's people that suck. Animals have got it figured out. Right? They don't live for profit. They don't fight against each other unless there's only one piece of meat and there's two dogs that eat it. You know, they don't do all the evil things. People do things evil just to be evil. You know? When we talk about people behaving like animals, they're not behaving like animals, they're behaving like people. Because animals are a lot more similar. I mean, Franz Marc was all over this, right? And he focuses on animal life, and he tries as best he can to sort of capture the spirit, the energy of the animal in the painting by really spending time watching them, mapping their behaviors. And so this wonderful picture of these Siberian dogs is basically a white picture, right? With touches of yellow and blue, which is exactly what you see in a snowstorm, right? You catch the sunlight on one side and all of the shadows are blue. You remember this from the Snowzilla, right? You go out and look at the hole your feet made. They were blue, right? And how the dogs are really, in many ways, they're perfectly in tune with nature, aren't they? By sharing the same color, right? He said animals, you know, what we need to understand from animals is how they have he even said this, they had a pure relationship with the world that we didn't have. It's almost like this reaction against how industry has divorced us from a sort of primal contact with our environment, right? And the animals got it. Animals understood it. And he said, by studying animals, we can get that harmony back. There's where he falls into step with Kandinsky. Kandinsky says we need to find the harmony behind the chaos. And Marc says, hey, there's a way. Look at animals. They've got it. And it almost sounds like biblical, doesn't it? What did Christ say? Like, you know, behold the birds in the trees. Do they worry? Right? And there's something about that message of nature and harmony that Franz Marc picks up. It was Franz Marc's blue horses. As he worked his way in 1911 and 1912, he stops using natural colors. This is when he's working alongside Kandinsky. And he's the second huge player in the Blue Rider. And in fact, it is his blue horses that gave the Blue Rider group part of its name. Right? Marc's blue horses, Kandinsky's knights, equals the Blue Rider. And he published extensively about what he was doing as well. And he makes his works try to capture increasingly not what the animals look like, but the energy of their movements, the energy of their actions, and how that is in harmony with the world around them. So the arch of the horse's hips and shoulders, mane, are echoed in the movements of the landscape behind it. And this is his way, like the color scheme we saw a second ago, this is his way of showing the fact that the horses are attuned to their world in a way that can offer a lesson to us. We've got a nice Franz Marc at the Phillips collection too, one of these. His late works get a bit more angular. But again, show animals harmonizing, melding with their this really cute deer, right, folded up in the forest. And there's a sense that you can see through everything, can't you? You know, okay, granted, this bit right here is, I think this is the window behind you or something that they want. It's just a picture. But there's still a sense of sort of translucency to it as we move over. And yes, he's being cubist painters, so he's picking that up. But they're nestled down in their forest as the birds sweep their way through. And, you know, the birds are just following the rhythm of the wind. And the animals are picked up in the forms of nature itself, and they really become one with their world. This is what we could be if we weren't so messed up, right? This is where and here's, I'm going to give you a direct quote from Franz Marc. An instinct led me away from people to a feeling for these pure beasts. And he's using force. The ungodly people around me, particularly the men, did not arouse my true feelings, whereas the undefiled vitality of animals called forth everything good in me. I found people ugly very early on, but animals seemed to me to be more beautiful and more pure. You know, and I think that anybody that's into animals understands this. You know, why does Marymount bring dogs here on test week to settle you down, you know, and bring them into the atrium outside of Leeds? Because there's something about that nature of just, I don't know if you're afraid of that in the US, if you are, you know, there's something about just watching things. I walk sometimes home via the path that goes through the park here, right? Now, one across 26, and there's a path that drops down in the park and drops you down onto Vernon or so, and I can get home that way, just a bit longer. But I'll see deer on that path, and it just makes my day, you know, because you realize that no matter how much we're in this, you know, this metropolitan region of 4 or 5 million people, where houses are priced out of the price range of anybody but lawyers, right, or people who can do for 20 years, there still is nature there, and, you know, they're scared of me. I don't want them to be, but they are, you know, I'm not going to shoot them. But once you see something like that, it's just like, this is better, you know? Or the rabbits that feel across 26 all the time, you know? And Franz Marc was on to this, right? Sadly, he was enlisted in World War I. He was shot and killed in the war. Very, very sad thing, but he wrote back about his paintings from the front, letters to his family, and talked about how I even before the war broke out, I knew something was wrong with where we were going. And these utopian ideas that we see both him and Kandinsky developing are ideas that are meant to sort of, I think, address the growing chaos that they're seeing. This chaos that erupts the year after this is painted, right? 1914, beginning of World War I. And what we'll see is that German Expressionism after the war is a totally different piece, right? German Expressionism after the war is world-weary, is critical of society. These don't criticize society per se. They present the utopia. They present somewhere to go. And after the war, they simply point their finger at what's wrong out there. And everything seems much more pessimistic. Well, okay, we're still earlier than 4:45, but later than 4:35 hit. Hurry home, don't get in a wreck. I get a feeling that because we didn't want to go home early, it's an absolute guarantee that it's just going to rain. Right? And whenever we over-prepare for something, it never really comes. So I will see you guys on Tuesday. What are your isms group of isms essays due? Did anybody turn those in? Okay. You know, the next groups, right, you got to do 10 before it's all done, right? So, but I haven't started grading them yet, so if you wanted to round some home tonight, you could do it. I've always figured that I can't count as late if I haven't started to grade it yet. You know what I mean?